How's it going, folks? Can you guys hear me okay? All right, welcome back. Happy Thursday. So, guys, we are getting a whole new chapter moving along. This train doesn't stop for anyone. And we're going to start the chapter today and we're going to finish today as well. Okay? And today we're going to go over the respiratory system. So now we are in the final stretch. We're going to be covering the final four chapters for the fourth exam. And then after the fourth exam, during the finals week, we're going to have a final. Now, I think I mentioned this before. I'm going to say it again. If by the time that you're done with the fourth exam, and I grade everything, put all the points together, if you have enough points for an A, you don't need to take the final. Okay? Because taking the final is not going to add, it's not going to make you an A plus. We don't have A plus at the community college. So you don't need to take the final if you have already A on the fourth exam, but I will let you know. So after I put all the grades together, if you do have an A, I will send you an email. Okay? All right. So let me share my screen with you. And today is all about the respiratory system. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to take a look at what we call the respiratory passageway. What is this? The respiratory passageway are the structures and the organs within the respiratory system. And we're going to see how we can divide the passageway, the respiratory passageway, into two groups of structures, okay? Then we're going to spend some time talking about the mechanism of breathing. How do we breathe? How do we inhale? How do we exhale? We're going to talk about the transport of gases in our blood. And specifically, we're going to focus on a CO2 transport in our blood. Oops, right here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the control of breathing and the role of surfactant in breathing. Okay? So let's start from the basic here. Let's start by talking about what are the structures and the organs of the respiratory system. And as I mentioned earlier, we can divide the respiratory system into two groups of organs. we have the conducting zone and we have the respiratory zone. All the structures here that are in blue, folks, I color-coded them for you. These all belong to the conducting zone. So the nose and the nasal cavity, the pharynx, right here, the larynx, right here, the trachea, right here, the bronchi. There are several bronchi, primary, secondary, tertiary, and also what we call the terminal bronchioles. They all belong to the conducting zone. Okay? Now, what does it mean by conducting zone? Conducting zone means that these organs, these structures, all they do is to pass the air from point A to point B. That's it. From one structure to another. Okay? Then we get into the respiratory zone of our respiratory system. And the respiratory zone includes two different structures. It includes what we call the respiratory bronchioles and includes what we call the alveoli. Guys, the alveoli are the functional unit of the respiratory system. Okay? What is going to happen within the alveoli? First of all, what is the alveoli? The alveoli are tiny little air sac deep inside of the lungs, and we have about 300 million of them per lung, and we need each one of them. What do? In the alveoli, this is where gas exchange is going to happen. What do we mean by gas exchange? Well, we're going to have the exchange of CO2 going from the capillary into the alveoli so we can exhale, and the O2 going from the alveoli into the blood capillary so that the oxygen gas can be distributed all over the body. All right? Now, we need every single one of those alveoli, and we can't get them destroyed because if your alveoli gets destroyed, it will not grow back. And as the alveoli gets destroyed, the function of your lungs is going to decrease, okay? Eventually, your lungs is not going to be non-functional. So let's go over each one of the structures right here in a little bit more detail. Let's start with our nose. So our nose contains different structures. One of them is those two big holes here in the front of our nose. These are what we call the nares or the nostrils. And they allow air to go from the environment inside of our nasal cavity. Okay? Now the nasal cavity, it is bilateral. We have the right nasal cavity, we have the left nasal cavity. And the walls of the nasal cavity, they are covered by mucous membrane, aka the mucosa. Now, what is the function of this mucosa? The mucosa is going to help to moisten the air by the mucus that it makes. It's going to help to warm the air. And the mucus is going to help to trap pathogens, pollutants, fibers that get inside our nasal cavity. All right. Now, as I said earlier, the nasal cavity is split into two. It is bilateral. And in the middle of the nasal cavities, we have a wall called the nasal septum. So the nasal septum is the wall that separates the right and left nasal cavity. Now, we all know that when you have a respiratory viral infection, you have the cold, you have a flu, and then all of a sudden, our nasal cavity is constantly dripping, right? Why that is the case? Well, what happens here is that our mucosa becomes inflamed because of the presence of the respiratory virus. And one of the hallmarks of inflammation is the overproduction of fluid. So the runny nose is because of the inflammation of the mucous membrane within the nasal cavity, okay? There's a question here, why don't we have just one nasal cavity? Because we have two lungs. And each one of the nasal cavities is going to be, pushing in more air inside of our trachea. So that allows an extra amount of air going inside of our trachea and eventually inside of the lungs. Okay. Moving on into the pharynx. So we just discussed the nasal cavity, which is right here. Right behind the nasal cavity, now we have what we call the pharynx, aka our throat. Now, the pharynx is divided into three different sections. And guys, in an exam, you need to be specific. Okay? If I am pointing to a section of the pharynx, it's not enough just to say pharynx. You need to tell me if I'm pointing to the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, or the laryngopharynx. So these are the three different sections of the pharynx. Now, within the pharynx, we are going to find the different tonsils. I don't know if you guys remember, but our tonsils belong to our lymphatic system, right? It was one of the lymphoid organs. And that is because inside of the tonsils, we're going to find the white blood cells that is going to help to fight anything that is foreigner coming inside of our body. Now, on top of the nasopharynx, we're going to find a group of tonsils called the pharyngeal tonsil. All the way in the back of the oral cavity, we're going to find the palatine tonsil. And then all the way behind our tongue, we're going to find the lingual tonsil. So we have a pharyngeal tonsil, palatine tonsil, and a lingual tonsil. Okay? Now, these tonsils here, sometimes they are removed. Especially if kids have a lot of tonsillitis, which is the inflammation of the tonsil, which can get swollen and inflamed and is very painful. Sometimes they have them removed. Okay. All right, so we talked about the nasal cavity, we talked about the pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Now let's take a look at the larynx. And the larynx is also what we call our voice box. And I'm going to explain to you why that is the case. Now, first of all, where is the larynx? Everybody look up here, please. Guys, these structures right here, all the way up down here, they all belong to the larynx. Okay? Let me also show you here. So this right here, all the way up to the second ring of cartilage down there, this is the larynx. And we can see right here in the back a structure that also belongs to the larynx. We're going to talk more about it in a minute. Now, what does the larynx do? The larynx is going to connect our pharynx, specifically the laryngopharynx, with the trachea. And the larynx contains different structures that you guys do need to know for the exam. One of those structures is this big piece of cartilage that we have right here that we call our Adam's apple, but this is called, the scientific name, which you should be using for the exams, is what we call the thyroid cartilage. Now, is it just guys that have a thyroid cartilage? No. Females have thyroid cartilage too. So it wasn't just Adam that ate the apple. Eve ate it too. Okay? Now, male have a more pronounced thyroid cartilage, and that is due to the, presence of testosterone when we are going through puberty. But females also have a thyroid cartilage, although they are smaller. Underneath the thyroid cartilage, we have another ring of cartilage called the cricoid cartilage. And guys, the cricoid cartilage down here it marks the end of the larynx. From this point down, now we're going to have the trachea. Okay, so understand again, the larynx ends at the cricoid cartilage. Below the cricoid cartilage, now we have the trachea. Now, in between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, we are going to find a little soft tissue right here. And we can actually feel it. If you take your fingers and you feel your thyroid cartilage and then run your finger down right here, you can feel a soft spot. This spot is what we call the cricothyroid membrane. So it is a membrane right there. Now, why do we care about this cricothyroid membrane? Folks, this cricothyroid membrane, it is a landmark for a very important emergency procedure called cricothyrotomy. What is cricothyrotomy? Let's say that someone is eating a big piece of steak or a big chunk of apple, big bite of apple. And then instead of biting into it and chewing it, they swallow it. They're gonna swallow and they're gonna swallow that up, and that is gonna get stuck right here in the back of the oral cavity, okay, of the oral pharynx right here, or it could be down into the laryngopharynx. Now, what happens if we have a big chunk of apple or steak stuck right there? Well, now you are officially choking, right? Because you're blocking the passage of air through your pharynx into the trachea. You can't get air into your lungs. You're choking. If you're lucky enough that you have a healthcare professional that knows how to do a cricothyrotomy, what they're going to do, they're going to take a knife or a scalpel. They're going to fill your cricothyroid membrane right here. And now they're going to make a cut. They're going to make an incision right through that membrane. And then they're going to take a pen, just like this one here. They're going to empty the pen and use the tube of the pen to keep that opening open so it doesn't close. And that will effectively save that individual's life. Because now you created a passageway in order for the air to go in and out of your lungs. Okay? This is what is called a emergency cricothyrotomy. I have a question here. Is the cricoid cartilage where I hear croaky sounds? Croaky sounds. I am not sure what those croaky sounds are, Larissa. Now, the other structure of the larynx is something that we call the epiglottis. So let me show you here where the epiglottis is. So this structure right here, right behind the tongue, is the epiglottis, okay? What is the function of the epiglottis? Guys, imagine that my hand right here, this is the opening to the larynx, okay? And this hand right here is our epiglottis. Every time that we swallow, the epiglottis is going to come down. The tongue is going to push the epiglottis down. And now whatever is that we swallow will not go inside of the larynx and get inside of the trachea. Instead, it's going to go down into the esophagus down here. Okay, so the epiglottis is very, very important because it's going to prevent any food from entering inside the trachea. So let me show you the action, a little animation here of the epiglottis in action. So we can see every time that we swallow, the tongue will literally push the epiglottis down, closing the opening to the larynx, preventing anything that we swallow from going inside of the larynx. Okay? And this is why, folks, you can actually try this right now. Did you know that you cannot swallow and breathe at the same time? If you don't believe me, try. Swallow and hold your swallow and then try to inhale. You can't because your airway is blocked by the epiglottis. Okay? Does the epiglottis sometimes trip up, causing choking? Yes, it can. Sometimes what can happen is that we might swallow something that is going to come down too fast, and sometimes it can get in before the epiglottis fully closed. Or we swallow something and the epiglottis can lift up a little bit, allowing something to get inside of our trachea. And now immediately, what are we going to do? We're going to start coughing. And that is a reaction, okay, to that presence of the foreign object inside of our trachea. So is it true that we swallow at the wrong tube, like some people say? Yes, meaning that it can go into the trachea instead of going down into the esophagus. That's what they mean by it, okay? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the larynx, we're still talking about the larynx here. The larynx is also what we call the voice box, because within the larynx, we're going to find the apparatus that allow us to be able to make sound, to speak, to sing. So what we have right here, I want you guys to understand what you're looking at. This right here is a superior view of the larynx, to the entrance of the larynx. So the doctor is going to put a camera, and we're going to watch a video in a little bit here. They're going to put a camera in the mouth. They're going to keep the epiglottis open. So the epiglottis would be over here, okay? And now we can have a nice view of the entrance to the larynx. Now, here we have what we call the vocal folds, also called the true vocal cords. Then to the side, anchoring the vocal folds, we have what we call the ventricular folds, or the false vocal cords. Now, how do we make a sound, guys, with our voice? What we do is that we're going to push air from our lungs. The air is moving upwards, up the trachea, okay? And then this air is going to pass in between the vocal folds, and the vocal folds, they're going to open, they're going to close, and they're going to vibrate. I don't know if any of you ever played the drum or played the guitar. When you hit the string of a guitar, the string vibrates and makes the sound. That is exactly how we make a sound. Okay? It is the vibration of the vocal folds as the air passes through the in between the vocal folds. And the vocal folds, they can stretch, they can thicken, they can make, and what that is going to allow us to make different sounds and different notes. All right? So let me show you this very interesting video of the vocal folds in action. If you have never watched a vocal fold and how they work. Let's see this right here.
All right, come on forward. Come up real high. Swing out real far. And say E.
Let me go back here just for a second. I want to show you guys something. You see here at the bottom, guys, this is the epiglottis, okay? Which is being lifted right there. Right there in the middle, we can see the true vocal cords, and then to the side, we can see the ventricular folds.
Breathe. E.
Now look at the vibration.
Lower E.
Looks like an alien, right?
Okay, let go quick. Now louder E. Okay, now glide from low to high.
Now look how it stretches on a high note.
Good. And now high to low.
And how it shortens and thickens in a low note. Isn't that cool? I hope you had your lunch already. This is where our head voice can vibrate, producing whistle notes. Yes, whatever sound you make is because of the vocal folds. Are we swallowing food through that? No, we are not. We shouldn't, right? This is the opening of the larynx, which then is going to lead into the trachea. We swallow food into the esophagus, which is a different tube behind the trachea, okay? Why do men have deeper voices and women have higher voices? Well, that has to do with actually our thyroid cartilage, and the thickening of the thyroid cartilage and the enlargement of the thyroid cartilage can actually change the positioning of the vocal folds. Now, evolutionarily speaking, that is more controversial. Why male in general have a deeper voice than females? One of the hypotheses is that usually, okay, evolutionarily speaking, it was perceived that an animal, a male of that animal, with a louder or deeper voice was a better mate than other animals. Now, why that was perceived? So what is the evolutionary reason behind it? Because again, testosterone is going to cause an enlargement of the thyroid cartilage, and that is going to lead to the deepening of the voice. So the more testosterone a male has, that means the deeper the voice and, hypothetically speaking, a better mate, okay, than other males. So that is the hypothesis, Theo. Any other questions, guys? All right, guys. So moving on. So again, let's recap. We talked about the nose and the nasal cavity. We talked about the pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. We talked about the larynx. Now we're going to get into the trachea. And what I want to do is this. I want to take a little slice of the trachea right here, and I want to put this under the microscope. Okay, so we can amplify it. So we can see two different tubes right here. There's a tube in the front, and there's a tube in the back. The tube in the front, folks, excuse me, this is the trachea. So the trachea is right here. While the tube in the back, this is the esophagus, which is going to lead inside of the stomach. So whatever we swallow should go into the esophagus, not the trachea. Okay? Now, if I take a little slice of the inside of the trachea, right here, and I take a look at the cells that are lining the trachea, we can see that those cells, they have hair-like structures on the surface of the cells. I want to ask you guys a question. You want to hypothesize, why do we have ciliated cells inside of our trachea? What do you think they do?
Cilia moves out all the things that goes um inside our trachea, like sweeping.
Yes, absolutely. Now remember, the cells of the trachea, they're also going to make mucus. Okay, so here we have a big glob of mucus in the trachea, and this mucus is trapping pathogens, is trapping fibers, is trapping pollutants. Do we want the mucus with all that gunk to go deep inside of our lungs, guys? No. Do we want it to stay right there in the trachea? No. We want that to move upwards. How is it going to move upwards? The cilia. So the cilia, as Angelica mentioned, it beats. All right? And they beat upwards. This is what we call the ciliary escalator movement, not the ciliary elevator, the ciliary escalator movement. And the ciliary escalator movement is very important to prevent what? To prevent lower tract respiratory infection. Because if the cilia gets paralyzed or the cilia gets destroyed, now the mucus with all the gunk is going to go deep inside of our lungs, causing a lung infection. Okay? Let me give you an example of something that can destroy and paralyze your cilia. Smoking. So for all the smokers out there, and I don't care if it is cigarette smoking, vaping, marijuana smoking, Any type of smoking will cause the destruction of the cilia. And that is going to cause you to become more prone to lower tract respiratory infection. Okay? I have a question here. If when we ever have a sore throat, is that feeling in the esophagus or the trachea? Well, our sore throat is more of the larynx. So it's more of an upper respiratory infection. It would be in the larynx and our tonsils, right? All the way in the back of the oral cavity. Okay? So it's not really down into the trachea. It's definitely not the esophagus at all, or the trachea is actually more upwards in the respiratory tract. Okay? Now, so there's something else that I want you guys to notice here about the trachea. Can we see how we have these rings right here? This blue, light blue color structures. These are rings of cartilage. And these rings of cartilage, they have a name. They are what we call the hyaline cartilage, also called the C-ring structure. And guys, we have these rings of cartilage throughout the entire trachea. What are they doing? Why do we have them? We have these rings of cartilage in order to keep our trachea open. Because we don't have any muscles on the walls of the trachea like we have in the esophagus right here. In the esophagus, we have a smooth muscle. But the trachea, there is no muscle within the walls. So the only thing that keeps it open are the presence of the C-ring structures, these rings of cartilage. Okay? Now, if you look at this ring of cartilage here, we can see that they have a C-ring shape to them. They are not an O-ring. Why do you think that is the case? Why do they have a C shape? Why not a full circle like this? Look at it, guys. Look at my drawing here. What would happen? Attachment point? No, not the attachment point. To keep the esophagus flexible.
Keep it balanced.
Balance?
Sorry.
No balance? Go ahead, Angela.
To support
The C-ring doesn't have
airway.
muscle, so we know that muscle contract. So if we want to keep the air inside the trachea, we don't want the muscle there, because if we have muscle in our trachea, it's gonna contract.
Uh-huh. Okay, but the question is, why is the C ring a C, not an O?
to help during the breathing inhalation. It helps keep the soft tissue have space to expand when swallowing food. Oh, sorry.
Right. Not for breathing. Not for breathing. But yes, it has something to do with the food that we swallow. Because again, where does the food go when we swallow them? Into the esophagus.
Give space
Guys,
for the
right, and the esophagus needs to expand. Right? Let's say again, we swallow a big slice of pizza, the esophagus will expand. Now, if the esophagus expand and we have an O-ring shape in our trachea, that would stop the food from going down. It would prevent the esophagus from expanding, and it would block the food from going down the esophagus. Okay? This is why these rings of cartilage, they are C-ring shape, not an O-ring shape. Okay? All right, moving on. Now we are going to talk about the bronchi. Guys, bronchi is plural, bronchus is singular. Okay? And we have three different sections of the bronchi. We have the primary section, or the primary bronchi. We have the secondary section, or the secondary bronchi. And we have the tertiary bronchi. Now, where are each one of those bronchi? Folks, when the trachea splits into two, and now the tube goes inside of our lungs, this is the primary bronchi, right here. When the primary bronchi now branches off into smaller branches, now it becomes what we call the secondary bronchi. When the secondary bronchi branches off into smaller branches, now it becomes the tertiary bronchi. Our bronchi is like an upside down tree. Imagine that the trachea is the trunk of the tree, okay? And then the bronchi are like the branches, excuse me, the branches of the tree. This is what the bronchi and the trachea looks like an upside down tree. Now, something else that I want to mention in this slide right here, and I need everybody's attention here, please. Guys, once again, our larynx ends right here at the cricoid cartilage. From this point down until before it splits into two, this is the trachea. And we can see how the trachea has all these rings of cartilage right here. These are the hyaline cartilage. These are the C-ring structures, keeping the trachea open. Now, in fact, the C-ring structures, they go beyond the trachea. They also continue into the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and even the tertiary bronchi. Okay? Keeping the bronchial passage open. Next, let's talk about our lungs. And if you can take a look at our lungs right here, we can see that the lungs, just like the heart, they have a triangular shape to them. And just like the heart, we're going to find the apex of the lungs right here on the top. And at the bottom, we have the base of the lungs. Okay? Now, we do have two lungs. They are bilateral. We have the right lung, we have the left lung. But the two lungs are not symmetrical. They are not identical to one another. In fact, one of them is smaller than the other. Can anybody tell me which one is smaller? The right lung or the left lung?
The left lung.
It is the left lung. Why? Why is the left lung smaller than the right?
Because the overall shape and texture is slightly smaller than the right.
No, the reason why it is smaller, because of the heart. Meaning what? Meaning that the heart, which is positioned right here, will occupy space from the left lung. And this is why the left lung is smaller than the right lung. Okay, so in fact, the right lung has three lobes. It has a superior, middle, and inferior lobe, while the left lung only has two lobes, only superior and inferior. In the left lung, we have this line right here separating the superior from the inferior lobe. This is what we call the oblique line or the oblique fissure. We also have an oblique fissure in the right lung, but it's separating the middle from the inferior lobe. And in the right lung, there's an extra fissure called the horizontal fissure, which separates the superior from the middle lobe. Okay? All right, guys. Now we are finally deep inside of the lungs. And now we're going to take a look at our alveoli. And remember, the alveoli is the functional unit of the respiratory system. This is where we're going to have the exchange of gases. Okay? Now, before we talk about the alveoli, let's take a look at the bronchi and the bronchioles that are, that lead to the hanging of the alveoli. We have the terminal bronchiole, which it is an extension of the tertiary bronchi. So the tertiary bronchi would be here, this section. And then branching off from the terminal bronchioles, we're going to find the respiratory bronchioles. Now we can see here that hanging from the respiratory bronchioles, we have all this tiny little air sac. These are what we call the alveoli. Alveoli is plural, alveolus is singular. Okay? And usually the alveoli, they group together forming little sac, or what we call the alveolar sac. Now, this is what I want to do. I want to take a few of these alveoli right here, and I'm going to take a knife and I'm going to split them open. I'm going to cut them in half. And we're going to take a look at the alveoli right here at the bottom. Okay, so we're looking at different alveoli right here. Now, the walls of the alveoli, they are made of 1 cell thick. Again, guys, imagine how fragile that is. You see the sheet of paper here? Imagine that this sheet of paper was made of 1 cell thick. That's how fragile, how thin the walls of the alveoli are. And the walls of the alveoli are made of a type of cell called the epithelial cells. Then we can see all these purple-looking things right here. These are what we call resident macrophages. Why are they called resident, guys? They are called residents because they live inside the alveoli. Look, usually macrophages, which is a type of white blood cell, they stay within the blood. They circulate in our bloodstream. But in a few places, like our skin, our lungs, the alveoli, in our brain, we are going to find the resident macrophage. Now, my question to you is this: why? Why do we need to have a resident white blood cells inside of our lungs? What do you guys think?
So when the red blood cells circulate through the body, they deliver oxygen to them so that they can maintain the alveoli, the whole lungs.
No, macrophages are not red blood cells. Macrophages are white blood cells that are involved with our immune system. Let's see here. To help protect us from toxins in the air in case of infection to the lungs. Absolutely. Guys, I want you guys to think about this. Inside of our alveoli is one of the most exposed parts of our body. Okay, because every time that we inhale, we bring the outside in. So we need to have a protection mechanism to help us prevent the pathogens, pollutants, fibers, toxins from going inside of our lungs. One of the protection mechanisms we have is already inside the nasal cavity. Why do you think we have hair inside of our nasal cavity? Because it looks cool? So we can brush our hair? No. The hair in there is already helping to filter, to trap toxins, pollutants, fibers that is coming inside of our nose. Then we have a mucus that is produced by the cells of the trachea. Why we have the mucus? Because we like to swallow it? No. It's because the mucus, again, is going to be trapping pathogens, fibers, pollutants. The same reason why we have macrophages inside the alveoli. Because when something foreign gets inside the alveoli, the macrophage is already going to be there. And macrophages are phagocytic cells. They can engulf and destroy whatever it is. Okay? And finally, we have these green-looking things right here. These are cells called surfactant-secreting cells. Take a wild guess what they make. They make something called surfactants. What is surfactant? Surfactant is an oily fluid that helps to decrease the surface tension of water. Let me pause here for a minute and explain this a little bit more, okay? Guys, we all know that we have water inside of our alveoli. How did the water get in there? From the air. The air that we breathe in has moisture in it, right? Especially it's been raining the last few days. There's a ton of moisture. There's a ton of water in the air. So when we inhale that air and the air gets all the way inside of the lungs and in the alveoli, there will be water in that air. That water will be inside the alveoli, will accumulate inside the alveoli. Now, if you look, everybody look up here, so I can share with you this annoying thing. I'm not the only one looking at it. If you have a faucet in your home that is constantly dripping, like this one here, we all know how annoying that is. We can see that this droplet of water, as it is formed, it starts to stretch before it actually becomes a single droplet and it falls from the faucet, right? We can see the stretching right there. What is holding a water droplet together? Hydrogen bonds are holding the water droplet together. Okay? And this hydrogen bond, they create a surface tension of the water. This is why if you belly flop in a pool of water, it's going to hurt. We all know that. It's gonna hurt. Because of all the hydrogen bonds that is holding the water together, and we have to break those bonds. Now, guess what? The hydrogen bonds in the water that is inside the alveoli will prevent the exchange of gases inside the alveoli by having the water in there. Now, this is where the surfactant comes into place, because the surfactant will break the hydrogen bonds of water, facilitating the exchange of gas between the blood capillary and the alveoli, in which the CO2 is going to leave the blood and go inside the alveoli so we can exhale, and the oxygen gas can go from the alveoli into the blood so it can be distributed all over the body. Okay? Now, as is less about lung collapsing, more about decreasing the surface tension of water. Now, folks, and this is why when we have a very premature baby, okay, babies that are very premature, they came out very early, the lung of the baby is not mature yet. The lungs are not producing surfactant. And this is why very premature babies need to be in a ventilator, right? To help them breathe. The ventilator is going to push air in and out of the baby's lung. And again, why? Because their lungs are not mature. The lungs are not producing surfactant yet. Therefore, it makes it difficult for the babies to breathe. Okay? All right, moving on. Now I want to talk about the mechanism of breathing. How do we inhale? How do we exhale? And in order to understand the mechanism of breathing, we need to talk about a physical law called the Boyle's law. Now, don't freak out. Boyle's law is very simple. This is what Boyle's law says, okay? Boyle's law says that there is an inverse relationship between volume and pressure inside of a container. Again, there is an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. When the volume of a container is high, the pressure is low. Okay? When the volume of a container is low, the pressure is high. So let me show you here in this little experiment, this little device here. So here we have a cylinder in which we can change the volume of this cylinder. Now the cylinder here is attached to a pressure gauge right here that can measure the pressure inside of the cylinder. Okay, so let's say that in the cylinder right here, we have a volume of 4 liters. So there's 4 liters inside of the cylinder, And let's say that this right here is air. Atoms, particles of air right here. If we look at the pressure gauge right here, folks, we can see that the pressure in there is 1 millimeters of mercury, which is the unit of pressure. Now let's do this. Let's take this cylinder here and let's half the volume. So now instead of being 4 liters, we're going to have 2 liters in there, right here. Now I want you guys to take a look at the pressure gauge. Now the pressure doubled. It went from 1 to 2. So we half the volume and double the pressure. Okay? So just to demonstrate how Boyle's law works, that inverse relationship between volume and pressure of a container. Now, what does that have to do with breathing? Guys, the mechanism of breathing follows Boyle's law to a T. How do we breathe? And again, this will absolutely be on the exam. Okay? You need to understand this. How do we breathe? In order for us to inhale, there are 2 different muscles involved in the process. We have a muscle right here, which is the major muscle in breathing. This muscle is called the diaphragm. And then we have muscles in between our ribs called external intercostal muscles. Okay, between the ribs. Now, guys, usually when we are not inhaling, the diaphragm has a dome position. It looks like a dome. In order for us to inhale, what we need to do is that we are going to contract the diaphragm. We are going to contract the external intercostal muscles. When we contract the diaphragm is going to flatten, just like this right here. So instead of being a dome shape, now it's going to flatten. It's going to be pulled down. When the diaphragm flattens, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. Now, what do you think is going to happen to the pressure inside of the lungs? If the volume goes up, what happens to the pressure? The pressure goes down. So we create negative pressure inside of our lungs. And that negative pressure is going to literally suck the air inside of the lungs. And that is what? That is inhalation. Okay? So let me repeat that. In order for us to inhale, we need to contract the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. The lungs will expand, the volume will increase, the pressure will decrease inside of the lungs. And that is going to suck the air inside of the lungs. Now, what about how do we exhale? We're going to do the opposite. For us to exhale, we have to relax the diaphragm. So now the diaphragm is going to go back to the dome position. We have to relax the external intercostal muscles. The lung shrinks, the volume decreases, and the pressure inside of the lung increases. And that is going to cause the air to be pulled out of the lungs. And that is exhalation. Okay? So inhalation and exhalation is all about a negative and positive pressure inside of the lungs. Is that clear, guys? Any questions? Now, not only the diaphragm is involved, but also the external intercostal muscles are involved as well. Okay? Now, let me talk about some involuntary movements of our lungs and the respiratory system. One of them is coughing. Now, what is coughing? Coughing is our body trying to clear out our passageway, our breathing passageway. Let's say again, for example, that we have a little grain of rice that gets inside of the trachea. Immediately, we're going to start coughing to help to push that grain of rice upwards and get it out of the trachea. What is a hiccup, guys? A hiccup is an involuntary contraction of the diaphragm. When we have a hiccup, is the diaphragm contracting and being pulling down, and that causing air to jump inside of the lungs. It causes inhalation, right? When the diaphragm contracts, we're going to inhale. And yawning, we don't really fully understand about yawning. The one thing that we know about yawning is that contagious. I guarantee you, just by talking about yawning right now, there are many of you that are going to start yawning. Okay? It is contagious. We don't know exactly why, but we know that it is contagious. So let's watch this little video here on how our lungs work, which is going to kind of summarize everything we have talked about so far.
Many of us have hundreds of things on our minds at any moment, often struggling to keep track of everything we need to do. But fortunately, there's one important thing we don't have to worry about remembering: breathing. When you breathe, you transport oxygen to the body's cells to keep them working and clear your system of the carbon dioxide that this work generates. Breathing, in other words, keeps the body alive. So how do we accomplish this crucial and complex task without even thinking about it? The answer lies in our body's respiratory system. Like any machinery, it consists of specialized components and requires a trigger to start functioning. Here, the components are the structures and tissues making up the lungs, as well as the various other respiratory organs connected to them. And to get this machine moving, we need the autonomic nervous system, our brain's unconscious control center for the vital functions. As the body prepares to take in oxygen-rich air, this system sends a signal to the muscles around your lungs, flattening the diaphragm and contracting the intercostal muscles between your ribs to create more space for the lungs to expand. Air then whooshes into your nose and mouth, through your trachea, and into the bronchi that split at the trachea's base, with one entering each lung. Like tree branches, these small tubes divide into thousands of tinier passages, called bronchioles. It's tempting to think of the lungs as huge balloons, but instead of being hollow, they're actually spongy inside, with the bronchioles running throughout the parenchyma tissue. At the end of each bronchiole is a little air sac called an alveolus, wrapped in capillaries full of red blood cells containing special proteins called hemoglobin. The air you've breathed in fills these sacs, causing the lungs to inflate. Here is where the vital exchange occurs. At this point, the capillaries are packed with carbon dioxide, and the air sacs are full of oxygen. But due to the basic process of diffusion, the molecules of each gas want to move to a place where there is a lower concentration of their kind. So as oxygen crosses over to the capillaries, the hemoglobin grabs it up, while the carbon dioxide is unloaded into the lungs. The oxygen-rich hemoglobin is then transported throughout the body via the bloodstream. But what do our lungs do with all that carbon dioxide? Exhale it, of course. The autonomic nervous system kicks in again, causing the diaphragm to ball up and the intercostal muscles to relax, making the chest cavity smaller and forcing the lungs to compress. The carbon dioxide-rich air is expelled, and the cycle begins again. So that's how these spongy organs keep our bodies efficiently supplied with air. Lungs inhale and exhale between 15 and 25 times a minute, which amounts to an incredible 10,000 liters of air each day. That's a lot of work, but don't sweat it. Your lungs and your autonomic nervous system have got it covered.
All right, folks. Moving on. So now I want to start discussing about ventilation. And so we're going to see how ventilation is measured. And to measure ventilation, we use a device called a spirometer. So this is a spirometer, what it looks like today. This was a spirometer back then. It used to be a huge machine. Now it sits like a little laptop, okay? Now, before we talked about the spirometer and a spirogram, let's understand a little bit more about lung volume and capacity. We breathe about 12 times per minute on average. And every time that we inhale, guys, we take about 100 ml of air inside of the lungs. So it's 100 ml in, 100 ml out. Okay, this is inhalation and exhalation. So if you multiply 500 by 12, we get what we call the minute ventilation, which is about 6,000 mLs of air going in and out of the lungs in a single minute, 60 seconds. Now, not all of that air actually will reach the alveoli. Out of the 500 mLs that we breathe in, only about 350 will actually go all the way deep inside the alveoli. So if you multiply 350 by 12, now we get another number, which is our alveolar ventilation rate, which is about 4,200 mLs of air that goes in and out of the alveoli in a minute. Okay? Now, what if you or someone you know, an individual, let's say that they had COVID, and then they never quite really recovered from COVID. They have what we call the long-term COVID or COVID lungs, in which makes it difficult for them to breathe. They get tired, they walk a little bit, and then they get out of air. So you're going to go see a doctor, a pulmonologist, which is a specialist in the respiratory system. And one of the things the doctor is going to ask you to do is a spirometry test. Okay? So, and that is going to result in an analysis called a spirogram. Now, what is a spirogram? How is it done? A spirogram and a spirometry test is a very simple procedure. So you're going to walk into the clinic or the hospital. Most likely, you're going to see a technician. You're not going to see the doctor. We never see doctors these days. And then the technician is going to take a tube and is going to place inside of your mouth. They're going to clamp your nose so you can only breathe it through your mouth. And the tube is attached to a computer, a little machine. And then the technician is going to tell you, okay, I want you to breathe 3 times normal. So you're going to inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. And then they're going to tell you, after the 3rd time, I want you to inhale as hard as you can. So you're going to go, and then you're going to exhale as hard as you can. You go, and then you're going to breathe normal again. Okay? That's it. You are done with the spirometry test. So now all that is left to do is to take a look at your results. So let's take a look at the results of a spirogram right here. Guys, when we are breathing normally, like what we're doing right now, this is called the quiet breathing. Okay? The quiet breathing. And the amount of air that we take in and out of our lungs during a quiet breathing is what we call the tidal volume, or the TV. And on average, the tidal volume is about 500 ml. So it is 500 ml in, 500 ml out. 500 ml in, 500 ml out. Now, when we inhale as hard as we can, we get another measurement right here. This is what we call the inspiratory reserve volume, or the IRV. And the IRV is about 3,100 mLs of air on average that we can inhale when we inhale as hard as we can. Now, when we exhale as hard as we can, we're going to get another volume right here. This is what we call the ERV, the expiratory reserve volume. Now, when we combine the TV plus the IRV plus the ERV, we're going to get what is called the vital lung capacity, which on average is about 4,800 mLs of air. Now you can look right here in the spirogram, folks. Can you see this region right here at the bottom in green? This is what we call the residual volume. What is the residual volume? The residual volume is the air that stays in our lungs even after you exhale as hard as you can. We can never fully exhale the air out of our lungs. Otherwise, our lungs would collapse. The residual volume keeps the alveoli inflated. Have you guys ever heard of people that had collapsed lungs? That is because they are losing their residual volume. Maybe there's a damage to their lung tissue and they are literally sipping out all of that air that is keeping the alveoli inflated. Okay? And their lungs will collapse. When you add the vital capacity with the residual volume, you get another measurement called the total lung capacity, which on average is about 6,000 mLs of air. Okay? Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the transport of CO2 and oxygen in our blood. Now, we all know how oxygen is transported in our blood. We already talked about the blood before. We know that oxygen is going to go from the alveoli into the red blood cell and is going to attach to the heme in the hemoglobin. And then that oxygen is going to be distributed all over the body. Okay? Now, what about the CO2 though? What about all the CO2 that is being produced when our cells go through aerobic respiration? Guys, what is aerobic respiration? Aerobic respiration is the utilization of oxygen gas to synthesize ATP. This is why we breathe the oxygen gas, because we need the ATP in order for our cells to have energy. During the process of synthesizing ATP from oxygen gas, two things are going to be made as a byproduct, waste product of aerobic respiration. We're going to produce water, H2O, and we're going to produce CO2, carbon dioxide. Now, this carbon dioxide is toxic. We can't keep this carbon dioxide in our cells, in our tissues. We need to get rid of it. How do we get rid of the CO2? We're going to send the CO2 into the bloodstream. Now, here's the deal though, and this is very important. When the CO2 goes into our blood, guys, CO2 does not travel as CO2 in water. When CO2 gets in our blood, CO2 is going to bind to water and is going to form a chemical called carbonic acid, H2CO3. Now, this carbonic acid here is not very stable chemical. As soon as the carbonic acid is formed, the carbonic acid is going to break down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. HCO3 minus is bicarbonate, H plus is hydrogen ions or protons. So we're going to have this constant formation of carbonic acid and breakdown into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So our CO2 in our blood travels as carbonic acid and bicarbonate. Okay, about 80% is bicarbonate and 20% is carbonic acid. Now, eventually, this blood is going to pass all the way through the capillaries in the lungs, right here. And we need to get rid of that CO2. How are we going to get rid of the CO2? Well, to get rid of the CO2, there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And carbonic anhydrase will break down the carbonic acid back into CO2 and water. Now that CO2 can leave the capillary by diffusion, go into the alveoli, and then when we exhale, we are gonna get rid of that CO2. You need to know this for the exam. This process is what we call the bicarbonate buffer system. Okay? Because another function of this bicarbonate right here, guys, HCO3 minus, is that bicarbonate is a buffer. And bicarbonate will maintain the pH of our blood. And we know that our blood pH needs to be what? Slightly alkaline, between 7.35 and 7.45. And the presence of the bicarbonate helps to maintain this narrow pH. Any questions, folks? So let me say this again. You need to know this chemical reaction right here. Okay? All right, so let's talk about some impaired oxygen transports. Hypoxia is when we have low levels of oxygen gas in our blood. Now, that could be to anemia. If you have low red blood cells, for example, you're going to be hypoxic because you don't have enough oxygen gas traveling throughout your body. If you have a pulmonary disease in which you're not getting enough oxygen, in your lungs, you're going to have hypoxia. If you have a blocked blood or airway circulation, you're going to have hypoxia. And hypoxia is, usually if you are hypoxic, you're going to have a cyanotic coloration to your skin. You're going to have bluish skin and mucosa for lack of oxygen, okay? Another very serious condition is called the carbon monoxide poisoning. Can anybody tell me what is a common source of carbon monoxide, guys? How is carbon monoxide formed in our environment?
Like defective microwavable popcorn.
Defective microwavable popcorn? No, that is not the main source of carbon monoxide. From a heater that is broken? Nah, it depends on the heater, not quite.
In our
Guys,
car.
yes, our cars. If you're driving a gas, what we call the internal combustion energy. If you're driving an electric car, your car is not producing carbon monoxide. But if your car rides on gasoline or diesel, and when you turn on that engine, and now your engine is burning the gas or the diesel, in the process, it will form carbon monoxide. So guys, carbon monoxide is produced when we are burning fossil fuel. If you burn a piece of wood or a log or charcoal, you are producing carbon monoxide. Okay? Now, why is carbon monoxide so dangerous? Carbon monoxide is so dangerous because carbon monoxide will bind to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, and they're going to replace the oxygen gas. Now, can we survive with carbon monoxide? No, carbon monoxide will not lead to the formation of ATP in the cells. Cells need oxygen gas. Now, when you are exposed to carbon monoxide, you can't tell. It has no smell, it has no color, you can't hear it, you can't see it. Yet, it is binding to your hemoglobin. This is why we call it silent killer, because if someone doesn't get to you and get you out of that place within 5 minutes of you passing out and give you 100% oxygen gas to breathe in, you're going to die. Okay? It's very, very serious and dangerous. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about the control of breathing. You know, when we watched the video today, we saw that breathing is an autonomic process. What does it mean, folks? It means that we don't need to think about breathing, right? And this is why we can go to bed at night and sleep, and we don't have to worry about if you're breathing or not. Now, that being said, I have another question for you. Can you control your breathing? Can you guys right now, can us, right now if you want to, can we increase or decrease our breathing?
Yes.
Yes, we can. You know, right now, if I want to, I can hyperventilate, right? Go, I'm controlling my breathing. And that is because our breathing involves two voluntary muscles, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. And I can contract and relax those muscles. So our breathing has both an autonomic component as well as a somatic component to it. Okay? Because there is an autonomic or automatic process and a process that is conscious as well. All the way in our brain, we have two little control centers. There is one control center in the pons and a major control center in the medulla. Let's focus on the medulla control center of breathing in our brain, okay? I want to show you guys a little scenario. Let's say that you have a kid and your kid really wants one of those ugly little dolls. What are they called? The Labubu. We all know what I'm talking about. They want a Labubu really badly. It's like $150 for this ugly Chinese doll. Anyways, you say, you know what? Sorry, I'm not going to get you a Labubu. And your kid, we are right in the mall. They're going to say, you know what? If you don't give me a Labubu, I'm going to stop reading. I'm going to kill myself. You, as the smart parent that you are, you say, go ahead, knock yourself out. So now you have a little John holding his breath, right? And he's trying really hard, holding his breath. What do you think is going to happen eventually? You think that you're going to be able to hold the breath forever? No, they're not. The question is, why not? So let's answer the question now. So if someone is holding their breath, okay, what's going to happen is that not only you're not inhaling, you're also not exhaling, which means what? Which means that the CO2 level in your blood starts to go up. Guys, does anybody remember what is the name of the chemical that is formed when CO2 combines with water? Carbonic acid, which is a what? An acid. So as we accumulate carbon dioxide in our blood becomes more acidic because we have more formation of carbonic acid. As our blood becomes acidic, our CSF, which is the cerebrospinal fluid, also becomes acidic. Why? Because the CSF is made from our plasma, our blood plasma. Now, when the CSF becomes acidic, guys, that is going to trigger our medulla. The medulla and the control center of breathing will become activated when the CSF is acidic. So what happens then? Now the medulla center will generate an action potential. And the medulla center is directly connected with the external intercostal muscles through the intercostal nerve and directly connected to the diaphragm through what we call the phrenic nerve. So here we have action potential traveling through those nerves, and eventually they get to the diaphragm, causing the diaphragm to contract, and eventually get to the external intercostal muscle, causing the external intercostal muscle to contract. Folks, tell me again, what happens when those two muscles contract? We're going to do what? So what happens when the diaphragm?
Contraction.
No. Increase volume, lower pressure, inhalation. Yes, we are going to inhale. So there you have it. Little John, who was trying to hold really hard and not breathe to get a labubu, now the brain is going to take over and he is going to take a big breath. He's going to inhale because it has a signal was fired by the medulla center. Okay, so what I want you guys to understand is that CO2 is a more important signal than actually oxygen itself. It is not the low level of oxygen. Low level of oxygen is a secondary signal. The primary signal is an increase in CO2 level in the blood. That is the main trigger for the medulla center. Okay, any questions, guys? All right. Now let's talk a little bit about hyperventilation, which I mentioned earlier. When someone is hyperventilating, folks, let's say you were swimming and then you're diving, okay, under the water. You're diving to as much as you can, holding your breath. When you come up to the surface of the water, what are you going to do? You're going to hyperventilate. What triggered that hyperventilation? Excess high levels of CO2 will cause hyperventilation. Why are we hyperventilating? To blow off the excess CO2 in our blood. Okay? Why? Because if we have a high levels of CO2, once again, that will cause acidosis of the blood. Our blood will become more acidic. Now, let's see here. What happens if you keep hyperventilating after the excess CO2 has been blown off and you keep hyperventilating? What's going to happen to your blood, guys? What is the opposite of acidosis? Alkalosis. If you keep hyperventilating, now you're going to blow off too much CO2, and now your blood is going to become alkaline or basic. And this is why, guys, this is why when someone is having a panic attack and they are hyperventilating, what do we tell people to do? To breathe in a paper bag, right? Do you know why they're breathing in a paper bag? They are recycling that CO2. They are taking that CO2 back into the bloodstream. Otherwise, they would hyperventilate so much and their blood would become alkaline. Okay? I have a question here. If this causes our blood to become more acidic when we breathe, how do we offset it since we're naturally more alkaline? Well, we offset it by blowing off the CO2, by hyperventilating. Okay? So maintaining the right level of CO2 in the blood is very important. All right, let's talk about some different types of lung diseases. What is emphysema? Emphysema is a chronic inflammation of the alveoli, which is going to make the alveoli very rigid. Hey guys, the alveoli is flexible. It expands when we inhale and then contracts when we exhale. Okay? If someone has emphysema, the alveoli are going to lose elasticity. It can't really expand. So you feel like you can't really get a full breath of air. Asthma is a chronic inflammation of the bronchial passage. And now the bronchial passage will constrict. Let's say that your bronchial passage before looked like this. If you are exposed to an irritant, now that can cause the constriction of your bronchial passage. This is asthma right there. Pneumonia. Pneumonia is an infection of the lungs caused by bacteria, viruses, fungi, or a parasite. And the pneumonia can lead to a very serious condition called ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. Guys, a lot of people that died from COVID-19 died because of ARDS, in which now the lungs, because of the inflammation on the lung tissue, it will cause the accumulation of fluid in the alveoli. And now, even with the fluid inside, with the surfactant inside, it's not going to be able to allow for gas exchange to happen. Okay. Now, our lungs develop very, very late. As I mentioned earlier, our lungs don't develop until in the late gestational fetal stage. Why? Because we don't need them. We don't need them. The lungs are collapsed inside of our body, of the fetus. Now, this is why, once again, if we have a very premature baby, that baby will need help breathing. They need to be ventilated. And oftentimes, they develop what is called infant respiratory distress syndrome, or IRDS. And that is because their lungs are not mature. Their lungs do not have enough surfactants. Okay? And that can be very serious. I have a question here. Why do scuba divers have to surface slowly versus a free diver when going deep down? Great question. One of the reasons, Theo, is because when you are scuba diving, you're not just breathing oxygen gas. You're also breathing many other gases, including nitrogen. When you go deeper down, the pressure increases, right? The lower you go in the water surface, the greater the pressure. And that pressure is going to push all of the nitrogen gas into your bloodstream. And when you go up, those bubbles, they can expand. And if you don't go up slowly, you go up very fast, the expansion of those bubbles can be very, very deadly. They could, for example, cause people to lose conscious, and it could even cause aneurysm. They could have a bursting of a capillary, okay? Because of the expansion of those bubbles within the capillaries. Any other questions, guys? All right, folks, another chapter in the books. We're really so close to that end. Reminder, the quiz for chapter 13 is open right now. You have until Sunday night to take the quiz. Don't forget to take those quizzes. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.